Good morning, Liberty. It is Friday morning, January 11th, 2019. My name is Michael Boldin, broadcasting live from my home office and studio here in downtown Los Angeles. 9:30 a.m. Pacific time here on the West Coast. So good morning to you, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happen to be tuning in. I appreciate you joining me here, whether it's live or in the archives. Today, I want to talk about an issue that I actually don't know much about. And I think this is, for me, and I've done this on a couple of shows in the past where I'm basically just exploring an issue by going through other people that I'm interested in reading and sharing with you what I'm finding. And the border wall issue has been real big, of course, of late, because the president is taking a stand on this and refusing to sign any funding bills that don't include money for the border. And now, because it seems very unlikely that that's going to happen with Nancy in charge in the House, well, mind you, and I may be incorrect in this, but I think the Republican House under Paul Ryan didn't fund this either. And I didn't see Trump taking a stand on that until he knew that it was going to be a partisan issue. So I'm a little iffy on that whole thing. But anyway, so this is a big deal. And of course, now the next step people are talking about is emergency power. So today, I basically want to go through three people, their articles or blogs that I respect a great deal, don't always agree with, but respect in their viewpoints and their approach to understanding constitutional issues on this discussion about emergency powers specifically. Not necessarily talking about the border wall itself, whether you should or shouldn't have it. My view is pretty straightforward. I don't trust politicians. I don't trust Washington, D.C. I don't want to give it more power to do something where it has failed what it's supposed to do, supposedly, in the first place. And I always think big picture. How is it going to be used in the future? So I don't trust what someone way down the line might use it in an economic crisis or in a Green New Deal when people want to escape. I don't trust them on how they will use a wall to try to block people in. And I know Ron Paul talked about that quite a bit in the past. And if you're focused and you're concerned about illegal immigration, I think, to me, the greatest threat to our liberty does not come from illegal immigration. It comes from unconstitutional powers exercised by Washington, D.C. in huge numbers. We're talking about a $22 trillion debt almost, and violations of our rights in greater numbers than ever in history. And yes, illegal immigration may cause economic problems. I don't really know. I'm not an expert in that at all. But my concern is Washington, D.C. Violating our right to keep and bear arms, violating our right to privacy, wasting all of our money, deflating or inflating the currency, the Federal Reserve, the empire. These are my concerns. But I do think it's a very important issue of the day to talk about the constitutional structure when it comes to emergency powers. Before we do that, I want to get over to my good friends out in the chat who I love joining me here. I really appreciate everyone here on the live chat. And I also appreciate everyone who leaves comments later on in the archives. We've seen a number of people over on BitChute, for example, leaving comments over there. But so hello over to Existence, Joseph Standrich. Well, it looks like me and Joe Standrich think pretty much the same. He says, "Good morning, Liberty, GML. Border walls, not only do they keep people out, they keep people in." Ward Lawrence, good morning from the Lone Star State. Heather Lee, hello. And I appreciate you guys really being here with me today. Now, again, I am no expert on this issue, but when things come up I don't study every issue that comes up every single day because there's always something new. And I think part of the way that the monster state defeats activists like all of us, people who believe in liberty, is by keeping our heads spinning. There's one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. Every day there's something new, some new issue, and you can get overwhelmed. So I try to focus on areas, and even as an organization at 10th Amendment Center, as a group, we focus on things that we're good at, and we slowly expand into new areas. Heather Lee is right. It's drama. There's always some new end of the world experience. And I was told by a friend many years ago, Jim Babka over at Downsize DC, he gave me so much advice. DownsizeDC.com. I think they also have a .org for their foundation. But Jim told me, look, a lot of organizations come and go because they are always in the fear-mongering stage that the next thing is going to be the end of the world. You have to give us money, and then it isn't the end of the world. It may be bad, but they're overhyping everything every minute, and people's heads are spinning. And he's like, I think, and I agree with this, it's more honest and more respectable and better long-term strategy just to level with people. Things are bad. They keep getting worse. But not every single thing is the end of the world. That's a kind of a we're going off on a bunny trail there anyways. So back to the border wall. I don't know a lot about the whole debate, but reading through a few people on this as I was studying over the last few days and week or so on this one, because it's so pervasive, because it's part of this shutdown situation, I thought it was important to kind of talk about it. And I found 3 articles from people, actually 4. We're going 3.5, from 3 people. Ilya Somin, who's a constitutional law scholar and a law professor. Michael Ramsey, who's the same, a constitutional scholar and a law professor. He also is part of the Center for Originalism at in San Diego. And then also my good friend Chris Ann Hall, who is a constitutional attorney, and she's awesome. So chrisannhall.com is really great. And she does a show here on YouTube as well, so I recommend that you subscribe to her. She's my favorite of the 3 as far as people because she's my friend. So even when we don't agree, she's my friend, and I love her and her family. So let's go through these. I want to first start out with Ilya Somin. Oh, before getting to that, I keep forgetting lately. If you're supporting what we're doing and you like this show or you find it interesting, please go ahead and smash the like button. Hit subscribe. Share the link with as many people as possible, because every time you do that, it triggers the algorithm here on YouTube. And then if you're watching later on another platform in the archives, it does tell people to pay attention. So the more that you do that, even if it's just this one little thing, it's a freebie that does help spread the word. So I appreciate everyone who has been smashing that like button. I know Domo had mentioned in the comments from a Monday show that they were actually trying to hit the like button and then checking back later, and it wasn't staying blue. So I'm not sure if we've got some YouTube problems or if that's a browser issue or not, but please do smash that like button. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all the comments and the feedback as well. So let's get into these articles. First of all, from Ilya Somin. Now, he takes the position that using emergency powers, the short version is using the emergency powers, he's not certain how it would go in court if Trump decides to do emergency powers. But he says even if they are constitutional according to Supreme Court precedent, and he's not really getting to originalism on this, even if it's constitutional under the courts, it sets a dangerous precedent. Let's go through a few things that he has to say here. He says, quote, "One of the fundamental principles of the Constitution is that Congress is the only branch of the federal government that has the power of the purse. The president cannot spend money for purposes not authorized by the legislature. That rule prevents any one person from controlling the nation's public funds." And from that, he says, oh, you can't have emergency, he puts emergency powers in quotes, to get around the requirement of congressional authorization. Now, he does note, and I think there is some debate on the laws that have been passed, but I want to get to that near the end of the show in Chris Ann's article. And I'm going to mention which ones at the end of this, and I think going through this with you guys is going to be helpful, which one I'm leaning towards. I have a kind of a preconceived notion where I'm going with this because I've read through these already. But going through it again live, I think will help me kind of understand where I'm coming from, at least as a novice on this particular issue. So Ilya notes that Congress has unwisely granted the president a wide range of easily abused emergency powers. easily abused. So he is acknowledging what a lot of people are talking about. Oh, well, of course the president can do this. He can take whatever he wants because of these things passed by Congress in the past. And I think this is a reminder that, like I mentioned in the episode on George Washington's address, that if you don't pay attention to the long-term use, and I saw someone talk about this in the chat. I had mentioned it as well. Basically, if you don't think, like if you only think short term, like I want A to happen because I am afraid of B, or I don't like B, or I want to change, whatever. If you're only thinking in the short term and you're not thinking about how that power can be used in the long term, that's a very dangerous situation. And Washington warned us about this, John Adams even, the idea of nipping the shoot of arbitrary power in the bud. Because even if you like the results of something now, if you're not paying attention to how it's going to be used in the future, you can't trust how politicians, you don't know who's going to come along in the future and how they're going to interpret this. The antis in the ratification debates over the Constitution, a lot of times there was no disagreement. And I think the best book to kind of get the story of this is Pauline Mayer's book. She passed away, a really good historian, called Ratification. It's a huge one, but it's written in a kind of a storytelling style. You learn reading this book and through other studies that a lot of times the anti-federalist was a term of propaganda, but a lot of times the antis weren't necessarily disagreeing with the federalists or the people in favor of ratification about how they were describing the use of power. But instead, they were concerned that in the future, someone was going to interpret certain clauses in their own way to benefit themselves. And I think a guy named John Lansing in New York, in the New York Ratifying Convention, where there was a 2-to-1 majority against, under Governor George Clinton, against the Hamiltonian group. He kept saying, like, ingenious men are going to come up with ingenious reasons to use a different construction of the same clause. And that is really the concern. Paying attention to how it's going to be used in the future. So Ilya points out that Congress has granted the president a wide range of abused powers, easily abused powers. They've passed these laws. And he notes two of them that are coming up commonly in the debate right now. Some point, he says, to 10 U.S.C. 2808 and 33 U.S.C. 2293 as possible sources of authority to do this. He goes on, he says, it neither actually grants it. Section 2808 says that if the president declares a national emergency that requires the use of the armed forces, he can use certain military funds to undertake military construction projects that are necessary to support such use of the armed forces. So he says, it is far from clear whether any supposed emergency caused by undocumented immigration really requires the use of armed forces or that a wall would be necessary to support such use. Indeed, he goes on, the law forbids the use of the armed forces for domestic law enforcement. And we can talk about posse comitatus, for example, as well. Section 2293 likewise only applies to a declared war or emergency that requires or may require use of the armed forces. So he's making the case that these sections really don't authorize what people are saying that they do authorize. But I don't think that's really... I'm getting ahead of myself. He says another federal law allows the military to condemn property for fortifications. But that only extends to projects for which funding has already been appropriated by Congress. So it's a really convoluted issue. Congress has passed this stuff in the past, and Chris Ann Hall's article really talks about these actions that Congress has done in more detail. So Ilya comes to the position that he doesn't agree that the laws on the books actually authorize what people say, but he does admit that the outcome of a legal battle on this is uncertain, because if Trump decides to use emergency powers, people are going to sue, it's going to go to court, and he doesn't know, and he's at least being honest. I think he's leveling with people. He's taking his position. I don't think this is the way that it's supposed to be. I don't think that this is what they passed or what it authorizes, but we don't know how the court's going to rule on this. He says courts often give presidents undue deference on national security and immigration issues. And we know this. There's a long history of the court saying, oh, we're not going to touch this, or we're going to take hands off, or we're going to defer to the executive branch because you're saying it's national security. So he says this, Quote, even if Trump can use an emergency declaration to secure funding, that does not mean he can seize property for eminent domain. And I agree that eminent domain, I think, is a really dangerous thing. Trump is a big fan of this, and I don't like that he's wanting to use it as an executive of the country now. I understand why business people want to do it, because they're getting property that people don't necessarily want to sell. Now, some people do say that there is no eminent domain delegated to the federal government in the Constitution within the states. It can only be used in federal territories. So that is another debate as well. So there's a lot of questions in this. You don't know how it's going to play out in court. There's a lot of convoluted laws that were passed by Congress. There's a lot of question about that. But the big message that Ilya Somin takes here that I find very interesting and actually agree with in general is that, quote, if Trump succeeds in using emergency powers to build the wall and seize private property, it would set a dangerous precedent for future presidents. Dangerous precedent. In other words, going back to that principle of you have to think, even if you support this, even if he can do this, how is this type of power going to be used in the future? How will it be used? And he did another blog talking about this, this article that he wrote over at reason.com, expanding on it. And I only wanted to highlight this one section because he's really explaining what he's concerned about as an example of dangerous precedent. And I think it's a really powerful statement that he makes here. Quote, consider a scenario where Elizabeth Warren wins the presidency in 2020 or 2024 or 2100. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be immediate. We don't have to only be short term. And he goes on, but Republicans in Congress refuse to allocate funds she claims are necessary to combat climate change and institute the gigantic Green New Deal program many progressives advocate. President Warren could then declare climate change to be a national emergency and start reallocating various military and civilian funds to build all kinds of green construction projects. Mind you, I have heard from progressive friends for many years that climate change is the greatest emergency facing us, the entire world. If you don't deal with climate change, I mean, I understand your constitutional views, Boldin, but the climate change doesn't pay attention to the Constitution. And if we don't do something about this, it's over, man. We're all dead. And that's the alarmism that people have about this. So if one person can use emergency powers to not only reallocate funds, but also to take property, then someone else can use it for other reasons. And they're going to cite that. I often talk about the Obamacare case and who was the justice? The justice in 2005. He just passed away, Supreme Court Justice. Well, he took the wrong position in 2005 on Gonzalez versus Raich, the great conservative. I can't believe I'm doing a brain fart on this one. Maybe someone in the chat's got me on this one. But he basically took a position that if you grow 6 plants in your backyard, consume them in your own home, never buy or sell them, that you are engaged in interstate commerce and the federal government can then control and prohibit that product. Scalia. Thanks, Joseph Standridge. Wow. So Scalia says that you could do this in 2005. Well, what did the Obama administration use to argue for their case in the Obamacare case? They cited him. They cited Scalia. This was one of their number one arguments. You can have non-economic activity that the federal government control. So the concern that Somin puts out here is how will someone use this power in the future? I think he's against it in general anyways, and maybe that's why he's talking about it. He is an open border guy, so you understand where he's coming from politically. But he does make a very good case for how the Green New Deal people might want to use this power in the future. So going from there, the next article comes from Michael Ramsey. And Ramsey is I think, across-the-board conservative. I don't know if he identifies with a political party at all, but he's a conservative, kind of old-school originalist, legal scholar, and he's part of the the Originalism blog and the blog for the Center of Study of Constitutional Originalism at the University of San Diego School of Law. These guys are serious. It's him, Michael Rappaport, and a number of other people. But just to go shortly through what he has to say here, he says, quote, "The Constitution does not provide the president with emergency powers." There's nothing in the Constitution that says, well, here's how the powers are delegated, and if there's an emergency, the president can do whatever the president chooses. The president has, and I like how he summarizes this, the president has the constitutional powers he has and may deal with situations, emergency or non-emergency, as they arise, using those powers delegated to him, period. There aren't emergency or non-emergency powers. There are constitutional powers and non-constitutional powers, period. Now, he says the president can direct the military to build fortifications. He does have that power delegated to him, including presumably a wall on the southern border. But it's subject to private property rights and federal statutes that may limit construction. But the president cannot spend money on construction of the wall unless it has been approved by Congress under the Appropriations Clause. Now, he does take the position that Congress has passed all kinds of laws, like Ilya Somin did, that can be read in a very expansive way. And he does basically take the position that he thinks that the courts would actually come down on the side of the president in this. And he says constitutional restrictions on delegation, so saying that Congress can delegate a power that was delegated to itself to somewhere else. I disagree with that, are probably weaker here than in other areas. But he's taking the position from case law, reading case law. So these statutes, he says, are likely constitutional. And if they give the president power to redirect funds as the president chooses to respond to emergency, as the president defines him, that would seem to give the president the power he needs to take the funds. But again, he's still restricted, as Ramsey points out, on the property issue. So that's just a short version that he has to say there. But I think the big issue that he points out that really kind of ties into what Chris Ann Hall covered in her article that we published this morning is, quote, "The Constitution does not provide the president with emergency powers." I don't see emergency powers in the Constitution. You have to actually interpret it to see it that way. And Chris Ann writes an entire article talking about this. I'm only going to go through some brief sections of it. She is really awesome. And I saw a bunch of people actually pointing out that they love Chris Ann here. Oh wow, I am really behind on a lot of the comments. I really appreciate all this. Matthew Butts says, Chris Ann is the only conservative you could call radical. She always gets me fired up. Just wish she was a bit more consistent. Already smashed. Happy Friday from Heather Rossi. Appreciate the smashing from Logan. Existence says Chris Ann is a rock star. Cool. Hi to Bob Brewer. I appreciate you being here too. And Jay O'Merica. Jeremy Anderson. Last city I lived in used eminent domain so the local college could build a massive dorm. The dorm was privately owned. So, and Liberty Cat says, didn't Obama allocate funds to start up Obamacare? And Heather says, oh, yes, he did. And he submerged all Obamacare monies in many directions buried within several government organizations called IRS extensions. Anyways, let's get over to Chris Ann. I appreciate all these comments. Really, really great chat going on here over on YouTube in the live chat. So Chris Ann writes an entire article really about emergency powers. And of course, it's linked in our show notes over on YouTube. And then I put all of our archives and all the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.goodmorningliberty. That's where you find all the archives for the show since we started it in July of 2018. As an experiment, and we're still going, so I appreciate it. And that's because you guys are giving me this feedback, the live chat, the comments, the emails to team@10thamendmentcenter.com, the subscriptions to all of our channels, whether it's YouTube, BitChute, Brighteon.com, Keyport, YouTube, plus the podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Google. I'm listing all this stuff. I think it's important to be wherever people want us to be, so we're trying to expand as much as possible. So she writes this entire article, is a presidential state of emergency constitutional? She starts out by saying, my inbox is being inundated with the question du jour. If President Trump declares a state of emergency to build the wall on the border of Mexico, is that constitutional? And she takes an interesting perspective. Rather than focusing on these laws that have been passed by Congress, like the law professors do, Soman and Ramsey, who I respect, but KrisAnne suggests that they're answering the wrong question. The wrong question is even being asked. She says, I am certain that is not the right question or perhaps the right way to ask it. But to ask and answer it correctly, let's briefly remind ourselves of America's constitutional structure and function. And then she goes into an entire section. This is not a short article. I think it's around 1,600 words. So it'll take you about 15, 20 minutes to read, but I think it's an important one. She goes through the foundational structure that I'm not going to go through in detail, talking about how the Constitution delegates a set of powers to the federal government. That which has not been delegated to the federal government under the 10th Amendment is reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. So you have to understand that first, in order to answer a question about the constitutionality of anything, is it delegated to the federal government in the Constitution, not what law has Congress passed in the first place. So that whole section, she's really covering that. So she goes on and says, so when people ask questions like, quote, can the president do, or can the House do, or can the Senate do, or can the Supreme Court do? I like how she puts this. The first sources that must be consulted are the Constitution and the people who drafted it. I would also add the ratifying conventions, because the intention of the authors is one thing, and it's important to understand what they wanted to pass. But the understanding of the people who gave it legal force, that is the people of the several states, actually they're the ones who gave it effect in law. So I think they hold. So when there's a conflict between the intention of a drafter, which sometimes conflicts, so like Hamilton, we know was a liar. For example, in the New York ratifying convention, he supported recommending amendments to the convention only, even though he didn't support it, but he publicly said he did, only because he knew that would quell opposition to passing it. So he was lying. He never intended to actually support amendments in the first place. So sometimes the intention of the drafters is very important, and that holds the legal meaning of the Constitution. But if the state ratifying conventions in general, if the people of the several states viewed it differently, then that, I think, would hold. But this is very, very close to my view here. And she goes on, she says, if the Constitution provides no authority for the activity, then the power does not constitutionally reside in the hands of the federal government. So more to the root of the question being asked, does the Constitution enumerate a power to the president to declare a state of emergency? The short answer, KrisAnne Hall says, is no. And that's exactly the same as the answer that Michael Ramsey, law scholar over in San Diego, says. The Constitution does not provide the president with emergency powers. Emergency powers or declaring a state of emergency is not something that's listed in the Constitution itself. Now, does that mean whether something should or shouldn't happen or the right political approach is different than the constitutional question? So every state of emergency KrisAnne Hall talks about refers to the National Emergencies Acts as the source of its authority. So the real question is, quote, does the Constitution authorize Congress to alter or expand or contract executive power by a legislative act? So basically, these emergency acts that Congress had passed are saying, okay, we know that such and such is not delegated in the Constitution, but we think that in emergencies, the president should have this power. And that's basically what we've heard on every expansion of federal power, on every issue. So on Obamacare, the Obamacare supporters, even if you could get through to them, I know when you ask Nancy Pelosi, oh, where in the Constitution is the authority? She laughs at you like this is an absurd question. But anytime you would get to the point of saying, well, what about the Constitution? The answer then turns to, well, it's archaic, or there's an emergency, 40 million people are going to die in the street. And on the right, a lot of people said the same thing about the Iraq War. If you could convince them that the Constitution does not authorize, convince them of the truth that the Constitution does not authorize the executive branch to make the decision over whether or not there is a state of war with another country, as Congress delegated to President Bush in the authorization to use military force, Congress can pass that power along. If you can say, okay, well, that's an issue, well, then the response was, well, this is an emergency. In an emergency, we don't all want to die. We have to stop these crazy madmen from killing us. So both sides and people who are interested in an end political goal will often use emergency, and we all know this, they use emergency as a way to take more power. And Chris Ann Hall's question, does the Constitution authorize Congress to alter or expand or contract executive power by legislative act? So they can't give the executive branch more power, can't give it less power, it can't pass its own power to the executive branch. And she says the constitutional answer to this question is obviously no. Congress cannot add powers that the Constitution has not delegated to the president, nor can they take away powers that have been delegated, she writes. For Congress to have the authority to add power to the executive branch, they would have to possess the authority to actually amend the Constitution by congressional act, and they do not. And she says this is it in and of itself delegating one of its own powers to the executive branch because it's an emergency. That's like saying, oh, in emergency, these are like red flag laws, these extreme protection orders. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed does not say the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed unless there's an emergency situation we have to go collect people's guns. It doesn't say that. None of these powers in the Constitution said this has been delegated. The federal government can do this, but it can do more if there's an emergency. That is ingenious men using ingenious constructions, as Mr. Lansing said in New York, to come up with different views of the clauses passed. So Chris Ann points out that if you consider how far we've strayed and how long we've been off the path, President Trump is doing nothing out of the ordinary. He is following a long history of extra-constitutional action. We have just accepted a broken government as the norm since at least 1861 when it comes to national emergencies. And she goes on. There's a lot of discussion and quotes from founders and from the ratifying convention. I urge you to read this entire article when you have a few minutes. But just to sum it up, she asks, where do we go from here? The question is not, if the president declares a national emergency and builds the wall, is that constitutional? Chris Ann says that's an easy question to answer. No. The question is, will we keep pretending to live in a constitutional republic while making it up as we go along? If you want the president to have additional power, you should be advocating for amendments, she says. Or don't say that you live in a constitutional republic, because that's a lie. So my position, as I mentioned, I was going to say, is much more in line with my friend Chris Ann's. I do think Ilya's position is very, actually, I think they're all very good. And they're all very educated people, and they're all smarter on this particular issue than I am. I tend to agree with Chris Ann Hall's approach as an overall philosophical principle, because she is the only one that I really see talking about not just, oh, Congress passed this obscure law some years ago. What did that say? She's taking it further back. Like, did Congress even have the authority to pass that law in the first place? And I think that even if she's wrong on saying the Constitution does not delegate a power to have national emergencies, let's say someone can find that in there. At least she's starting from that position. And when I disagree with people, if they're at least coming from the originalism perspective, coming from the text of the Constitution, the statements and intent of the drafters, and then the statements and the intent of the ratifiers to come to their conclusion, then we can have a good debate about it. But people who are basing their entire viewpoint based on precedent, court precedent, and congressional acts are not thinking about the Constitution. They're just, they're thinking about something else completely. I also like where Ilya comes from when he's not, even though he's not really talking about originalism, he's only focusing on the laws passed. But he's talking about what kind of precedent, where can this be used in the future, thinking about the long-term effects of someone taking additional power. So back over to the chat. Heather says divine invasion. Executive orders only apply to executives. I'm new to this, but love learning. I'm new to this too, Liberty Cat. The federal government is obligated to protect states, Bob Brewer says, from invasion, Article 4, Section 4. I think in that case, I know a lot of people make that argument, and maybe we should do a show on this here. How did the founders and ratifiers define invasion? Was it a lot of people crossing the border, or was it a military armed invasion? I would lean towards the latter on that, but I don't actually know. I saw a professor that I respect actually take that same position as well. So that's probably something to investigate as well. What did the founders and ratifiers think of the term invasion? And to start out on that discussion, you would look at some dictionaries of the time. For example, Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language in the late 1700s, not the 1828 version or the late 1800s, or anytime in the 1800s. You also want to look at a law dictionary because the Constitution is a legal document drafted by people and debated by people who were very familiar with law at the Philadelphia Convention. And one that they relied on heavily was Giles Jacobs' New Law Dictionary. I think it was in the 1760s. That was one of the leading law dictionaries of the time. So that would be the starting point to understand what the term invasion meant. Bob Brewer says Webster's 1828 dictionary says invasion equals intent to plunder. And I think that gets to my point that I was making. You have to actually... Post office, a post road, for example, is something that we think that post is being carried over. So if the federal government has delegated power to deal with post roads, then we think under a modern definition that they have power over all roads. But the founding definitions understood post roads to be roads that had post markers every mile or so on it. Basically, today's modern interstate highway system. It did not include normal thoroughfares in localities. So definitions can change over time, and although Webster's dictionary may say invasion equals intent to plunder, it may have been different in the late 1700s. We have to think about what the definition meant at the time that the document was ratified. So I think that is an interesting discussion. One that I don't have an answer to on that. So yeah, I think that covers a lot of the discussion. A lot of really interesting back and forth on this. Things for me to look at a little bit more in the future. I hope you guys found this very interesting, insightful. I'm learning as I go on this, and I appreciate you basically going through this process with me as I'm basically just talking about what I'm learning. I don't know all the answers. I think these articles that I shared, the 3 articles plus the short piece in the Reason blog from Ilya, I think they're very interesting and insightful. Please go through and read them, especially Chris Ann's article, because it's more on the foundational constitutional structure, and it's a little bit longer and gives a little bit more detail outside of the U.S. code that has been passed by Congress in the past. And of course, all of that is over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty. And I hope you guys all have a great weekend. I'm going to take a little bit of time off this weekend and do a little bit of relaxing. And I will be back again on Monday, Wednesday, Friday next week, and every week, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Make sure to smash that like button. Leave some comments. Feel free to send me an email over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. And I'll see you guys next week. Have a great weekend. Thanks so much.